That brings us to our fourth speaker, Erica Chenoweth, who is Associate Professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and the co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, a book that I can fairly say has electrified the field of political science. It has already won several prizes because of its surprising conclusion, which challenges a certain conventional wisdom. Now, most educated people know that sometimes civil resistance works, but most educated people will tell you, well, of course that works in civilized parts of the world, like Britain and its former colonies, like the United States, but it's naive and romantic and idealistic to think that civil resistance can be a force for political change worldwide. Erica, can you tell us why what your research has shown about that conventional wisdom?
Sure, and I should start by saying that I was one of those people at the outset of this study who thought that advancing the notion that civil resistance could work was naive, idealistic, and perhaps even dangerous. But in my own experience, I want to first just say what I mean when I say civil resistance. Civil resistance is a method of conflict, not necessarily an ideology about conflict, but it's a method of conflict in which unarmed civilians use a variety of coordinated tactics like strikes, protests, boycotts, and other methods of action without directly harming or even threatening to physically harm their opponent. And I was first introduced to this topic a number of years ago when I attended a workshop where a lot of the people there were making the claim that civil resistance could be in some sense a functional equivalent to armed struggle. That is, that it could be as effective or even more effective than waging armed struggle to achieve major political outcomes, like removing an incumbent leader from power, even a dictator, or creating an independent territory. So I was provoked and bothered by this claim, which I thought didn't have very much empirical support. And over the next couple of years, a colleague, Maria Stephan, and I collected data on all known major nonviolent and violent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And we looked at campaigns where there were at least 1,000 observed participants, meaning they were already fairly mature in terms of their size. And we looked at these popular movements that were trying to either remove an incumbent government or create an independent territory. Now, the reason we chose those two types of outcomes was because precisely of my skepticism. Because I thought that maybe nonviolent resistance could work if you're trying to establish greater rights, you're trying to expand your rights, establish labor rights and things like this, but it probably couldn't work if you're up against very powerful authoritarian regimes, for example. So the ultimate outcome of this data collection yielded well over 300 nonviolent and violent campaigns for those types of outcomes. And the shocking finding is this, that from 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns were more than twice as effective as violent insurgencies in achieving their aims, and that in especially the last 40 years, this trend has actually increased over time, such that nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly effective and quite a lot more frequent, whereas violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and increasingly unsuccessful. That is, they're going out of style and in a major way. So the reason for this, we think, is because of people power itself. What we found when we drilled into these cases was that the nonviolent campaigns were on average 4 times larger than the average violent campaign. And if you looked at them as a proportion of the overall population, they were something like 11 times larger. And they feature a much more inclusive civic spirit so that way more people are involved. That means women, children, the elderly population, people with disabilities are able to become involved in things like non-cooperation, which can involve much lower risk to physical repression, and it allows many more people to be activated. Now, the reason size matters is because once very large proportions of the population are involved, they start to change the risk calculations and the interests of, say, the security forces, who might be willing to shoot at a single person standing in a square, but when they look out over a sea of 100,000 people, and by the way, recognize their neighbors or children, They might just pretend they didn't hear the order to shoot. And once the security forces or economic elites or business elites or civilian bureaucrats withdraw their cooperation from the regime opponent, it's only a matter of time until these movements succeed. The last thing I want to mention about this is that we've also found that the way that these movements carry themselves out, the way they fight, really affects what these societies have looked like in the longer term. So societies that are emerging from a civil resistance campaign, even a failed one, are far more likely to emerge with democratic institutions within the next 5 to 10 years than campaigns where violent resistance was waged. And they're also about 15% less likely to experience a relapse into civil war within the next decade. So we would never argue that civil resistance always works, but it certainly works a lot more than its detractors would have you believe. And it certainly works a lot better than its violent alternatives, both in terms of the short and longer term.
In your study, how do you determine change or success in a movement? What determines whether it's a success?
Well, we used a pretty strict metric. There are a couple of criteria the movement has to meet. The first is that it achieved either the removal of a leader completely through irregular means, or they achieved territorial independence, that is, de jure independence, not just de facto independence. And that would basically be similar to the selection criteria of the cases. We only looked at those cases where they were trying to remove the incumbent leader through irregular means, or that they were trying to achieve territorial independence. The second criteria was that we looked at whether the campaign could have had, you can sort of make a reasonably good argument that the campaign had a direct impact on that outcome, right? So if an international power came in and just took out the leader, we didn't count that as a campaign success. If the leader died in office of a heart attack, even though you might make a conceivable argument that they were stressed out because of the movement and died, we didn't want to give our skeptics any ammunition. So we didn't count that as a success. So we only looked at cases where it was clear that the movement had an impact on the outcome, and that outcome had to have occurred within a year of the peak of the campaign. Meaning that if a campaign ends, but then 4 years later they get the outcome that they wanted, we didn't count that as a success. So this is actually a very strict criterion of success. We applied it equally across both the nonviolent and violent campaigns, just to defend against any skepticism that we were going easy on the nonviolent cases.
In the meeting, you said, gave a statistic that I found very striking, which is that movements that had 3.5% of the population or more were 100% effective in making change. Okay? But it caused me to think about the issue of, given, especially in the first world, the growth of mass media, and in some sense the control of mass media by a smaller and smaller group of people. Does that mean that it's more likely that you'll be able to, that people who want to buy change will be able to do that?
I don't think so. I'm a little more optimistic, and part of the reason is because civil resistance is costly action. So we're not talking about people who decide that they'll go to their computer and click on a button and say, yes, I support this particular activity or this activism. We're talking about people, chaining themselves to hardware and things like that, and taking real risks. So the movement from being complacent to being willing to do something, to actually going out and prosecuting a conflict using high-risk civil disobedience, I think is a major leap for many people, which is why these campaigns, though frequent, are by no means the rule in terms of human activity. I think that means that even though the threshold for participation seems to be about 3.5% of the population, tipping them over into success, it still means that would constitute 11-some million people in the United States. And I just don't see that many people doing real civil disobedience unless it was a pretty serious issue.